Hello everyone and welcome to Photography 101. My name is Jillian Bell. I'm a photographer and educator. I'm also a judge at the county and the state level for Minnesota State 4-H Photography Project. You'll also find me behind the scenes working with the Project Development Committee with the Minnesota 4-H Photography Project. It's wonderfully a delight to be here to share this with you. The goal today, we've got a couple of topics that we're going to talk about over the next 20-30 minutes or so. The first one, we're going to talk about understanding exposure. I'm going to talk about how to use this in relation to your camera modes. And then we're going to get into the artistic bit of it, talking about composition, finding your subject, and working a scene. Understanding exposure and different elements of exposure. This is more of a digital SLR idea, but definitely there are tips and tricks in here for anybody of any level. So it doesn't matter if you have a cell phone that you're using to take your project photos with, or a digital SLR, or maybe a point and shoot camera. Stick around, sorry about that, follow along, and let me know if you have any questions. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram under Minnesota 4-H Photography Project. You can also shoot us an email at 4hphoto@uvm.edu. You could also find us on the University of Minnesota Extension page under the 4-H Project under Photography. Let's get started. So understanding exposure. When we talk about exposure, we're talking about three basic elements: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's dive into that a little bit. It's important to note that when your camera is reading the light and finding exposure, it is basically balancing out all of those values into a neutral gray. Call that 18% gray. So it doesn't matter if you have a lot of light or a little bit of light, a brighter scene or a darker scene. The camera, your camera, no matter who makes it or what kind it is always going to try to balance to a neutral 18% gray. Now this works fine most of the time. If you have a great sunny scene, if you're working indoors and all the tones are right there in the middle, your camera's going to work just fine and there's really nothing to worry about. But, let's say it's a wintry day and you're outside, it's very snowy, you've got a lot of white tones, or maybe you're trying to photograph at night and there's many shadow values, there's more of a black quality to your photograph. This is where the exposure can get tripped up a little bit, and we've got something called exposure compensation that'll help you out with that. Now, if you're looking at your camera, you can either this is the act of incrementally adjusting the camera's exposure from default reading to the meter that it's given. This is usually done using aperture priority, shutter priority, or some program modes. If you have a camera phone, specifically an Android or an iPhone, you'll notice that there's a little sun looking thing that you can shift up or down. This is exactly what that is doing as well. So you're purposely making your image, the exposure, brighter or darker, depending on what your values are and how you want the photograph to look. So in this situation, we've got the image on the left, beautiful pink puffy flower that's lit by the sun. We've got a nice background there, and the exposure does a pretty good job on its own. The problem is when I walk around the backside of it and now I'm shooting into my light source, the camera is going to look at that light and try to turn it gray. It's similar to, that snowy day where I have a lot of white tones in my image. The camera is going to make those white tones gray, and that's going to make everything look muddy, a little bit less contrasty. It doesn't have the pop that we look for in a good exposed image. And so what we do in this case, we want to overexpose the image slightly, taking all those gray tones and moving them back to white where they're supposed to be for a more correct exposure. Now it's important to note that these three things work together. So aperture, ISO, shutter speed, they're all connected. We're going to explain what they are first, and then I'll show you how, you change one and another one has to compensate out of the three, again, to get the same correct exposure. But these elements, the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, they're going to change the overall look of your photograph. We'll deal with ISO first. ISO is similar to film speed. If you're ever familiar with shooting film with your camera, basically the lower the number, ISO 100, 200, 320, 400, something like that, those lower number ISOs are going to give you better clarity, better contrast, better sharp detail. The camera is is not very sensitive. It needs a lot of light to be able to capture that detail. But in scenes like this, when either time isn't of the essence, we can let that camera capture all of the light at its leisure. Doesn't matter if it takes a half a second or a tenth of a second or 3 seconds. Having a lower ISO is basically going to give us cleaner detail, better blacks, better contrast, less noise. ISO 400 or ISO 640, something around there. Those are kind of our middle ISO ranges. These are going to be very versatile for pretty much every everyday situation. So whether you don't have bright sunlight, maybe a little bit of shade, or you're moving indoors with a lot of window light or a lot of bright lights in your scene, I generally will pick an ISO in that middle range. 400, 640 again, maybe going all the way up to 800, because this is going to ensure that I have a shutter speed that's fast enough to stop action. But it's not going to make the photograph too noisy to break up the clarity and to affect the quality of my image. There are certain situations that I need a very high ISO. Nighttime photography is one of those scenes. If I have very fast action that I'm trying to stop using a very fast shutter speed, these are times that I want to use a higher ISO setting. So ISO 800, ISO 1000, 3200 ISO, something like that. You can even get up to 256,000 ISO. Write that down. It's a big number. Basically, you're telling the camera that there is not a lot of light, or you need a much, much faster shutter speed that the current light situation can give you. And so the camera is doing a little bit more guesswork to be able to use, to capture that image with a little bit of light. This is why we see more digital noise. This is why we see an image that isn't quite as crisp and clean as those lower ISO values. It's a very slight trade-off for being able to work within your aperture and your shutter speed, and within, having the capability to capture that image is only possible because you have that higher ISO that you can work with. Let's hope that makes sense. Moving on to aperture. Now, aperture is something, it's your f-stop of your camera. Again, with digital SLRs or some point-and-shoot cameras, you can physically control the f-stop that you photograph your image with. And in this situation, you can open that image up. This is a term that we use in the industry. That's a lower f-stop number. So f4, f1.8, f2.8, something like that. We're going to let in a lot of light. When we stop down the lens, we're going to have a much higher f-stop number. We're going to let in less light, but the trade-off is that we're going to get better detail and greater depth of field. So what does depth of field mean? Depth of field is the area of your photograph that is physically in focus. So the distance between the closest in focus point and the furthest in focus point is considered your depth of field. When we have a lower f-stop number, so f2.8, f4, one of those lower, again, f-stop aperture numbers, we're going to have a very shallow depth of field. So we see in our image here, the flowers in the foreground are outside of that depth of field range, and the mountains in the background are outside of that depth of field range. So they're going to be blurry, they're going to be out of focus. With a long depth of field, you can see here, we're going to crank up that aperture to f22, f11, f16. These are more examples of a longer depth of field type photograph. And here you can see that all elements of our frame are in focus, the flowers to the person in the middle to the mountains in the background. We're going to open up that f-stop. We're going to create more detail throughout that frame, but we either need more time to capture that detail, or we need a higher ISO if we can't have that time available. Again, those three elements work together. We'll see longer f-stops often in landscape photography or in architecture. This one's at f16. Another landscape, this is at f22. Choosing those higher aperture values is a wonderful tool if you have street lights or a sun that happens to be in your frame, because with those higher f-stop values, it'll naturally starburst out. And this is a technique that photographers use just to kind of help set their work apart and make it look a little bit more professional. On the other end of the scale, I love a shallow depth of field because it really helps isolate my subject and separate it from the background. Here, this gentleman at f2.8 is wonderfully sharp. You can see his great expression, but the living room, the dining room in the background, those are outside of that depth of field range, creating a really shallow point of focus just on my subject, just where I want it to be. We'll also see those lower f-stops, that more shallow depth of field in darker situations, like if you're at a restaurant or you're out photographing your friends at night. You need a very shallow depth of field to be able to capture that little bit of light that you have. And again, I'm isolating my subject here being the phone that is photographing or that's taking a video of the gentleman playing the guitar. Kind of a neat creative scene. Moving on to shutter speed. So the shutter speed is the amount of time that the photograph takes to be taken or captured. It is measured in fractions. So in your camera, you might not see that. It might just say 125 or 60 or something like that. But think in your mind that it's a 60th of a second. It's a 125th of a second. It's a half a second. Now, if you see the number 2 with little dashes behind it, that is 2 seconds. So the number 1 with dashes, that's going to be 1 second versus just a plain 2 is going to be a half a second. We want the faster shutter speeds to capture action. In this scene, I needed a 2500th of a second, so a very quick photograph to capture the water droplets as this duck was kind of shaking around in the middle of the day. You can see here that I needed an ISO of 1000. I needed a lot of sensitivity to capture that speed because my aperture was as low as it could go. I could only let in a certain amount of light. So I needed a higher ISO number to get that shutter speed really, really fast to capture this proper exposure. It's kind of fun. On the other hand, this is a 2-second exposure, so my ISO here is very low, down at 100, because I have all of the time in the world to capture this image, and I really wanted the water to float around and to show that movement in the frame with those slower shutter speeds. Using a tripod here, of course, is key, because I can't hand hold steady for 2 seconds, and I'm sure you can't either. So set it down on a tripod, or find a bench or something that you can set your camera down on and allow it to be stable while you're capturing an image of this kind. Kind of a good middle shutter speed to kind of keep your brain around is a 2/50th of a second. This will stop people that are, your brothers and sisters or your mom and dad that are running around. You're trying to capture action. Birds in flight or a bicycle that's coming past you really quickly. I'm going to use a continuous shooting mode. So I'm going to hold the shutter button down. It's going to go shoot, 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 shoot. In this case, I'm actually panning with my subject. So I'm going to start here and go shoot, 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 shoot. Hoping that 1 out of the 20 images I take is the one that I want. We're going to work with probability here. We're going to shoot many, many photographs to hope for that one that is the keeper. And we're just going to delete the rest of them because that's fine. No big deal. All right, so now that we understand those capabilities, the camera settings is something I want to move on to next. Now, these are different shooting modes. Basically, when we talk about camera modes, you're telling the camera whether it needs to take control and make decisions for you, or you're telling the camera certain bits of information about what you are photographing so it can make better decisions about the type of image that you get. The first one up on top is auto mode. This is a green box that you see. This is basically telling the camera that you, the photographer, you do not want to make any decisions and you want the camera to take 100% control. I use auto mode sometimes when I've got good light, it's middle of the day, and I want to focus on composition, or I want to focus on, those other elements of photography, leading lines, visual interest, that sort of thing. But unfortunately with auto mode, again, you are not giving your camera any information. So the flash might go off unexpectedly, or you can't set up that continuous shooting mode. You can't tell the camera any information. In program mode, this is kind of my snapshot mode that I use because I can tell the flash to fire or not to fire. I can turn that on and off. I also have limited control when it comes to continuous shooting or using a self timer, or setting my ISO, and then the camera is going to pick, again, the aperture and the shutter speed separately based on the ISO that I choose. In aperture priority, this again is a very common mode for me to use. I'm going to tell the camera which f-stop that I want to use. I might go into so far as to say which ISO that I want to use, but for the most part, I pick the aperture, and then the camera is going to choose the ISO and the shutter speed in order to get that exposure. And in both the program mode, in aperture priority, shutter speed priority, I'm going to use exposure compensation +1 if it's a very bright scene, very white, -1 if it's very black, if it's very dark. again, because my camera is going to meter read the light in a neutral gray mode. Shutter speed priority, similar to aperture priority, I tell the camera what shutter speed I want to use, and then it is going to pick the aperture, it's going to pick the ISO based on how it's reading the light and which shutter speed I pick. Full manual, you are telling the camera absolutely everything. You are not letting it make a decision for you. Read your meter. Look up what your meter is, and you want that little dial right in the middle. If it's a neutral gray tone, you want it off to the right-hand side if you want it brighter. You want it off to the left-hand side if you want it darker. But again, you are setting all three, the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO, and it's going to read the light and give you an idea, but at the end of the day, you, the photographer, are making all of the decisions. Here's a great example of those three working together. So here we have the aperture up top, the shutter speed in the middle, and examples of ISO on the bottom. So you can see as we move from left to right, in the aperture column, we have a higher f-stop number, a very long depth of field, everything is sharp. As we move off to the lower numbers, f2.8, f2, f1.4, you can see that depth of field is getting more shallow. Those clip art mountains in the background are getting softer. In the middle, on the left-hand side, we have fast shutter speeds, so stopping action. On the right-hand side, we have slow shutter speeds, showing motion. And then on the bottom, on the left-hand side, we have low ISO values, so nice, crisp detail. On the right-hand side, we have high ISO values, so much grainier image, but better sensitivity to light, or the lack of light. Here's a great example. So in this situation, I set up my camera in program mode, and it tells me that my exposure is f5.6 at a 60th of a second at ISO 400. But I'm thinking, this is my little brother running around. A 60th of a second, you can see there's a little bit of motion showing. I want a faster shutter speed. So I need to change the shutter speed, but I know that either my aperture or my ISO is going to change because I've changed one out of the three. I want a faster shutter speed, so I'm going to shoot for 2/50th of a second. So I'm going to move that shutter speed over 2. And in this case, I have a lens that can photograph at 2.8. So in this case, I'm going to move my aperture also over 2 to help compensate for the fact that I've moved my shutter speed. My ISO is keeping the same. Yes? Let's hope. Moving back to the start, let's say I can't make my aperture any brighter. Like 5.6 is the lowest number that I can take, but I still need the faster shutter speed. My only other option is using my ISO. So instead, again, to get my shutter speed to move over to 2/50th of a second, I also have to move my ISO over to 1600 ISO. They work in conjunction with each other because, again, I cannot change my aperture. This is going to give me a little bit grainier of an image, a little bit noisier of an image, but at the end of the day, I get the shutter speed that I need, and that's okay. Let's talk a little bit about composition and working your scene. So now that we got all of the settings and things figured out, let's really get down to the creative part of it. And how do we build an image? How do we work our scene? I'm sure if you've entered a project in the photography fairs before, either the county or the state level, you've heard us talk about composition, you've heard us talk about the rule of thirds, and we've asked you what it meant. This is the number one clue to judges that you know a little bit about photography and you can talk about composition in a way that makes sense and is relatable to the image that you have. Sorry, that's a hard word to say. In this situation, so I've got my subject off to the right-hand side of the frame because he is looking into the left-hand side. I want him looking into the image to help create that space and to give him room to look. I've also balanced off his white shirt with the white window in the background, again creating left to right balance between my subject and its background, filling the frame with visual interest. Graphically, this is what the rule of thirds look like. It's like a tic-tac-toe board you put over your image. And the idea is you pick your subject and you place it on one of those places where those lines intersect. That naturally gives it more visual interest. And then we move the three other points, again, to help move the eyes around the frame. So we use the rule of thirds to create a better composition by creating spaces that are visually interesting, to use leading lines, to use repetition, again, to help fill the frame with visually interesting things. This is an example of leading lines. So anytime you have lines in your photograph, think about if there's a way to give them a slight angle. Anytime you create lines that have a slight angle, it's going to allow visually your eyes to move from left to right or from top to bottom. It's another great way just to quickly give your photograph a little bit more interest and a little bit more creativity. Like I said, we also use repetition quite a bit. In this case, again, I'm placing my bee off to the right-hand side because he's looking to the left. And then I'm using those two other flowers that are similar in shape and repeating those colors to help, again, fill the frame visually all the way around. Creates a nice little triangle that you can bounce around in. Another example, think about your backgrounds. So in the image to the left, I found this little robin sitting on a park bench. And the first image was my safety shot. Something to prove that I saw this and he was really close to me. But unfortunately, if you look at the background on the left-hand side, it's pretty distracting. That bush was right behind the robin, and so it had a lot of texture in there. I couldn't really blur it out. And so thankfully, he was quite curious, and he was bouncing up and down from left to right along this park bench, and I was given another opportunity when he was on the other side to take a better composed image. I like the fact that I have the edge of the bench there on the left-hand side to create, again, more leading lines, more visual interest. But the big thing here is the background. Those trees are now further away, so they're easier to blur out, and the background here is less distracting in comparison to the first image on the left. Here's another great example. Cherry blossom trees, lots of texture, lots of color, lots of leading lines, but we're lacking a main subject here. The big thing you can do, especially if you have a wide angle lens, is try to pick one bunch of flowers that you can focus on and get really close to. Wide angle lenses have an expansive property to it, so the closer your subject gets to the front of your lens, the bigger it's going to seem. This is a common technique with cell phone cameras specifically. You can then use the rest of the flowers in the background just to create more texture and to create a little bit more of that color repetition in the background. But here, in comparison to the first shot, we have a definite sharp subject. Another example to simplify that same subject is to use your telephoto lens and zoom into portions of it. So here I'm overexposing my image just slightly by 0.5 or 1 plus over because it is a backlit scene. I wanted my sky to be nice and bright. I wanted to give a little bit more color to those flowers. I can even highlight just one bunch out of them using my full telephoto lens. And this to me looks like a watercolor painting. It's just really fun and light and colorful. And again, I'm overexposing it on purpose because my bright sky is really white and I wanted to showcase white in the background. Here's another great example. If you've ever been on vacation and found an interesting statue or a place that you want to document that you've been there, don't necessarily run to stand right up in front of it first off. Because you can see here, if my subject is standing, if my friend here is standing right underneath the sign, they get very small. She is very tiny in comparison, of the whole building, and I lose sight of who she is. And if you have a holiday card of your family, your friends aren't going to know who these people are. So the best thing you can do is keep your background, your statue in the same place, but move your subjects, move your humans closer to the camera. Again, same sort of thing. You're going to be able to, because your subject is standing closer to the camera, it's going to be larger, it's going to be more recognizable, but you still have the opportunity to capture that statue in the background, to capture that sign, and now it's a win-win. So you can clearly see their smiling faces and you can clearly document where they are. The other great advantage of this is you are moving away from the crowds. So if this is, a statue specifically that's very popular during the day, moving your family across the street and using, again, more of a wide angle lens, you can still capture the statue in the photograph, but now you've got this beautiful, like, hip to head photograph of your family positioning that statue in the background. It's much smaller, but it's still there, and you compositionally, it's just a stronger image. talked a little bit about lenses in this presentation. I just want to delve into that a little bit more. This works with your digital SLRs. It also could work with like point and shoot cameras using that W wide mode or that T telephoto mode. With cell phones, you do have a little bit of zoom, but most of that is a digital zoom. So you're actually cropping into the image and stretching it out, and that can affect your image quality. So be careful if you're using a cell phone in zooming in too much. Again, because if we're trying to print out 5x7s or 8x10s, just make sure that you can get an image with enough resolution so you can retain that clarity in that print. We call that pixelization, and it's something that your judge will probably mention. We won't knock it against you in your project, but again, it's just something to know. It's something to be mindful of. So I talked about on the wide angle side, again, that expansion. The closer your subject gets to the front of the lens, the bigger it becomes. This is telephoto compression. So I back up and I physically zoom into that full telephoto aspect. And those trees that are across the street, my statue of the archer here, they all look very nice and compressed, very simplified, highlighting my subject in a really nice way. If I compare this to the wide angle version, so I'm going to get physically closer to this subject and make sure his hand is really close to the front of my lens, it's a completely different look. So again, because that hand is closer to my camera, kind of like if I'm doing with this webcam, if my hand gets closer to the camera, it gets bigger. The hand that gets further away gets much smaller in comparison. This is wide angle expansion, and it's a really great way to create lines, to create drama, include a little bit more of the environment in your scene. Here's another example of that. The one on the left, I'm backing up across the street and zooming in. The one on the right, I'm standing on the same side of the street using my wide angle, and you can really tell the difference with the columns there. You can see how much smaller they look and how much larger the lamp looks in comparison. Again, because we're expanding or contracting those elements together based on the focal length that we use. Here's my last and favorite example. In this case, I've got a teeny tiny little toy car next to my vintage pickup truck I found out on one of my travels, and I wanted to make that toy car look life-size. The best way to do that, again, is to pull out a wide-angle lens and make sure that car is really close to the front of my lens. And what happens, you see the mountains in the background get smaller in comparison because they're further away. The car gets bigger, again, because it's closer to the front element of my lens. And this, to me, looks like a life-size photograph of a car. It's a really creative way to take the things that you like. Maybe you've got some toys at home or some action figures that you want to put into little scenes. And this is a really great way that you can make them look life-size and help tell their story of how they live. That's the end of what I got for you today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time and watching this video. If you have any questions, find us online on Instagram and Facebook. We have new pages, so please like them, follow us for different challenges and ideas. It's Minnesota 4-H Photography on Facebook and Instagram. You can also email us with questions, 4hphoto@uofm.edu. Lastly, you can find the photography section of the University of Minnesota 4-H project pages. Again, I'm Jillian Bell. It's been a pleasure talking with you all today. Thank you. Hope to see you out there at a fair in the future. Take care.